Art throughout history has depicted many forms of conflict, and considering the impact that war has on society, there is no lack of war depicted in art. Some of the most impressive pieces of war art are the monuments that people create for victories. In ancient art, these pieces are especially interesting, as we can see how these civilizations depicted themselves, their foes, and symbols of power. Two of the most well-known art pieces commemorating victory are the Palette of Narmer and the Column of Tarjan. By comparing these two artworks, we can see how this type of art has changed over time and how these societies represented themselves and their victories. The Palette of King Narmer is one of the earliest historical artworks and an icon of early Egypt, dating circa 3000 BCE. It was found buried within the temple at Hyrcanopolis for the god Horus, and some visual elements for which it is the first example of were used for more than 3,000 years, all the way through the Roman era. Slightly taller than 2 feet, the palette is a monumental version of the ones for daily use, which were common during the pre-dynastic era. These cosmetic palettes were used to prepare black eye makeup, which was of importance in Egyptian life to protect against irritation and reduce glare from the sun. Namir's palette is not the only enlarged or more elaborate one created. However, it is the most massive. There is a series of pre-dynastic ceremonial palettes in which the subject is either hunting or the wild and realm of nature. In the palette of Namir, we can see this theme shift. There are now scenes of warfare, as on the back King Narmer, wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, appears as the largest figure on the whole piece, towering over his enemy and slaying them. He appears a second time as his living Horus role, the form of a falcon with a human arm, holding down a man-headed hieroglyph growing papyrus plants. This imagery is a symbol of his victory over Lower Egypt. And on the front of the palette, Narmer, now in the crown of Lower Egypt, overlooks the decapitated bodies of his fallen enemies. As a bull, possibly the king himself or a representation of his strength, knocks down an opposing fortress's walls. Instead of the theme of controlling untamed forces of nature, as with previous ceremonial palettes, the palette of Narmer shows the theme of defeating archaic forces opposed to the king. This defeat of more archaic societies is a concept very common in ancient art, and while here it is representing real events, it is also showing the transition from the prehistoric to the historic period in Egypt. The imagery of defeating these foes on a piece commemorating the king Narmer is also a proclamation that the Egyptians' well-being lays within their king and sets the stage for the consolidation of state and political boundaries as they move into the dynastic age. The column of Tarjan is 128 feet tall and was built within the imperial fora, which is an area of several public forums built by Roman emperors. Overall, Tarjan's forum, once including a spacious plaza, 2 libraries, possibly a temple, and a grand civic space, and the column itself specifically celebrated the conquering hero's victory over Dacia. The column can be seen as 3 parts: the base, the shaft, and at one point a bronze statue of Tarjan at the top. The base of the column has garlands, a victory wreath that the shaft rises from, 2 images of Nike, the personification of victory, framing its inscription, and finally sculpted armor and weapons. These weapons and armor are another symbol of victory, as it represents spoils taken from the Dacians, more of which paid for the construction of Tarjan's forum and was even displayed there. The 625-foot frieze winding the column shaft 23 times tells the story of the 2 Dacian wars waged by Tarjan. In the scenes where Tarjan is present, leading, addressing troops, and performing sacrifices, he also appears larger than the soldiers. While this may be to make the narrative more readable, it also calls back to Egyptian figure representation of portraying those with more power and importance as larger, which is a formula that may have been set by the palette of Narmer. Another parallel at the top of the column is a scene where Tarzan views the decapitated Dacian heads his soldiers have brought to him. Surprisingly, however, only 21% of the column shows battle scenes. One scene in the middle even shows Roman soldiers tending to their wounds, something usually not seen within this type of artwork, and an acknowledgement that victory over the Dacians was not easy. With this, however, the record of the story told on the column is still skewed to glorify the Romans. For one, there are no dead Roman soldiers shown, and there is still a clear sense of the theme of the civilized Romans defeating their more archaic and barbarian foes, the Dacians. This can be seen in how the Romans are portrayed as uniform and clean-shaven, while the Dacians are shaggy. While the Roman buildings shown are solid and well-designed, the Dacians are humble. Most of the column, though, shows construction and other routine work done by the Roman army. Due to this, the imagery moves away from portraying the victors of war as a force of conquest like in the past, but rather one of order and civilization.